It feels like I haven't made a video for a few days, possibly because I was so incredibly busy. I don't have this information in front of me. I can talk about it endlessly nonstop. It's just a list of some key points that I want to make. I don't need an iPad in front of me. Talk about identification phenomenology. One of the fundamental, it's not a secret, as I've said before actually countless times in countless videos, the so-called secrets in hardcore metaphysics are only secrets because the nature of which they are not penetratable by the minds of conventional humans, and by that I mean people that spend 99% of their time, worrying about bills and their children and their wives and getting richer and getting laid and then garbage, laundry, all the superficialities, shaving, showering, impressing people at work, just the superficialities of general life. There's a completely different type of thinking, both abductive, and this of course is where apophatism comes in, of thinking that is necessitated to understand monistic metaphysics, and I mean, the most quintessential nature of Pythagorean metaphysics, which is also Greek, Platonic, Neoplatonic, and Indian. Nothing is known except through the modality of the knower. There's absolutely no distinction or differentiation. It's a distinction without a difference, if you will, in monistic metaphysics of both Indian and Platonic and Neoplatonic. There's no difference between Advaita Vedanta and the writings of Sri Sankaracharya, like the Upadisa Sahasri, or the Veda Chudamuni, or the Principal Upanishads, Brihadranika Upanishad, or any other Upanishads, and the writings of Plotinus or Plato or the Pythagoreans as far as understanding monistic metaphysics. I want to actually simplify things a little bit because actually I can go so deep down the rabbit hole everybody just starts scratching their heads and looking at me like I'm an alien or Illuminati. And make a simple point in that using conventional analogies that people understand from a daily perspective. And answer me this question, and I know how you're going to answer, but your answer is going to be a description, not an explanation. What is it that causes, a chick or anybody else that goes to a sad movie to start crying? What is it about that? If they're not part of the movie, why would a person get angry at watching some sort of movie that moves them, or watching a really sad movie and start crying during the movie? Now, we actually will use the words conventionally in the English called getting caught up in the movie. If a movie is really good, then it actually, you've heard this before, the movie's really good, I got sucked into it, whether it be action or drama. And all of this, of course, has to do with the identification phenomenology. And it'll very quickly lead into the fundamental secret of all monistic metaphysics, both Greek and Indian. Answer me this: what is it that would cause someone to, for example, cry at a sad movie? Don't say it's because the person is emotional, or don't make a comment like that, because that's going to be your answer. That's a description. That's not an explanation. What is it that would cause someone to get caught up in a movie? What is it that causes someone to see self and what is not self? And by self versus self, one with a capital S, if you will, and one with a small s, we're always differentiating out the fundamental premise of all monistic metaphysics, both Greek and Indian, and ancient Egyptian, and Pythagorean, on and on and on. Actually, there's not that many really good hardcore monistic metaphysics in the world. There's really only the Greek, the Indian, and the Pythagorean. Pythagoras could have been from Samos. Who knows? Nobody knows the answer to that. Also the Egyptians. What is it that causes someone to identify with something that they're not part of? Why would someone cry over, a sad movie, for example? Why would somebody identify self and what is not self, i.e. the psychophysical, the corporeal, the existential? This identification phenomenology, this Hegel called it, and I really absolutely hate, and I mean that with a capital H, hate Western existentialism. 99% of the stuff that's actually called philosophy is not philosophy at all. Philosophy, as coined by Pythagoras, or philosophia, the love of wisdom, has nothing to do with Nietzsche, Kant, to a greater degree Hegel. Hegel was an ontologist, but and I know quite a few people that actually got a degree philosophy at college, and all they did was study Western existentialists. Ayn Rand, don't mention people to me ever like Ayn Rand, Kant, Nietzsche. These people are not philosophers. What they are navel gazers. You know what a navel gazer is? What is the identification phenomenology there? The monistic metaphysics of seeing self and what is not the self. It's the same premise of someone says, and I've heard this question asked 1,000 times by 1,000 different people, more than 1,000. That's just my life alone. Saying, I don't know where my soul is. What happens to our soul after death? What happens, my and our implying possession? When someone speaks of the ontological self or soul or the spiritus sanctum, by the way, the ancient Egyptian word for the soul is the same word in Prakrit, which I translate. It's also the same word in Sanskrit, which I translate Romanized Sanskrit. It's also the same root in English. Aten in ancient Egyptian. Also, it's Aten in ancient Prakrit, and it's Atman in Sanskrit. We actually have... This is also why there's no such BS in ancient, this is what happens when you mistranslate hardcore monistic texts. There's no such thing as breath meditation in the early churches, or breath meditation. No, it's not. There's no such thing as breath meditation in any of the early Egyptian texts. Early Indian texts, both early Buddhist, early the Upanishads, they're not teaching breath meditation. It's talking about the Atma. You heard the English term atmosphere or atmospheric, actually discussing the winds, the air, but of course the root Atman, or the spiritus sanctum, literally the animus that keeps the psychophysical body alive. We're actually talking about the spiritus sanctum, or the Atman, or the soul. Yeah, to say someone has a soul, of course, implies possession. Has, meaning possession. Something has something else. Nobody has a soul. There's no soul in the body, but that is not a denial of the soul. Neither is it incorrect to substantially and accurately state that there is no signal in the radio. The consubstantiality between the signal and the radio is obviously so that one is tuning one to the other, and therefore you have an animated... Remember back in the day, you're not old enough, and neither am I really, they talk about turning the radio on as like, man, there's an animated... you couldn't see anything, not talking about animation, say the radio's got some animated program. It's the animation of the radio, meaning the signal that has been tuned into the consubstantiality of the psychophysical. In ancient Prakrit is Rupa Vedana Sanna Sankara Vijnana Namarupa Anatati. The actual most repeated phrase, and I've been through the 5 Nikayas, which are voluminous works about 6 feet tall, if you took all of them together. Digha Majjhima, Samyutta, and Gotara Nikaya, Kodaku Nikaya, the Udana, the Idivutaka, the Suranapada. I've been through all those texts 1,000 times. The most repeated phrase, the ancient Prakrit, and this is also true of the ancient Greeks, the Pythagoreans, the Platonic and Neoplatonic, is Isokaya Namisata Rupa Namarupa Anatati. This psychophysical, the corporeal, is not my soul. And of course, I'm using the word my and our in there, only conventionally to make a correct English translation. There is no my as implied possession. There is no body in the soul is not a denial of the soul. Neither is it incorrect to say that there's obviously no little people inside your television set. The animated television set, obviously with the projections and the images, of course, the consubstantiality of a tuned signal. It is correct from the nihilist perspective, and I despise nihilism, by the way. Correct from the nihilist perspective, there's no soul in the body. Well, you're right, there isn't one, and neither is there a signal in the radio. Neither are there little people inside the television set. And I'm trying to simplify this without going so deep down the rabbit hole that everybody starts scratching their heads and looking at me like I'm an alien. The commandment in the Sanskrit of Advaita Vedanta and the principle Upanishads is Tattvamasi. Now, of course, there's no true translation, but it's often translated as that thou art. That with a capital T, i.e. referring to the agathon or the absolute, that thou art. That's actually about the best English translation for Tattvamasi. Referring to the identification phenomena. Don't say a person is sad when they're watching a movie. That's merely description. What is it that causes someone to be sad watching a movie, or to be angry, or to be, start laughing their butt off at a funny movie? What is it? It's projection and identification. Projection and identification is the root of all ignorance, delusion, and of course suffering. To see self and what is not self, and both imply possession and projection, like you see the person in the mirror, that's the self. But which self is it? Well, that's myself. That's who I am. No. Namisata, the most repeated phrase in ancient Prakrit, and, you know, other than some yellow-robed Theravadins you'll find in Sri Lanka, there's not a single person, in Europe or the United States has been through the Pali Nikayas more than I have. That's the most repeated phrase. That is not my soul, or so, and I'm using the word my or our in there conventionally. That is not the soul. The psychophysical is not the identification phenomenology of seeing self in what is not self, the suffering and the root of ignorance, but not meaning conventional ignorance, referring to the psychophysical ignorance, but transcendental ignorance. There's actually two modalities, both in Greek and Indian, as far as which type of ignorance. The Greeks refer to as the euristostaias, or the nankie, or the tolma, which of course there's no translation for, just as there is no translation for the term nous. Nous can be translated as a word, it can be translated as, the logos. There's no translation for the word logos. I said nous, but also there's no accurate translation of the word nous either. There's a long list of ancient Greek metaphysical terms people think you can translate. Well, sure, depending on the contextual usage, you could translate it. No, you really can't. You have to actually understand fundamentally, without translation in your head, what these terms mean. But this is the principle, the extrinsic principle inherent to the principle, i.e., the attributional side of the absolute and the pure subjectivity that identifies and sees self and what is not self. All transcendence, i.e. theurgy or apophaticism, or the via negativa, i.e. the liberation ontology, spoken of in all monistic forms of metaphysics, is disubjectification. It is an absolute, undeniable fact from the premise of both logic and metaphysics and the Greeks and the Indians that no deed, no action is ever liberating. Ever. Okay? Good deeds have nothing to do with liberation. The Greeks, the Platonists, the Neoplatonists, and the Indians, and Sri Sankaracharya and the principal Upanishads, they were all extremely emphatic about good deeds have nothing, not jack crap, to do with liberation or liberation ontology as a principle. Never have, never will. It is absolutely illogical to think that. All actions, or in the case of, refer to the Sanskrit word karma, are completely unconnected to any type of liberation or wisdom. No knowledge, and this of course is the differentiation and distinction of episteme, empirical knowledge, i.e. knowing stuff, right? Like a computer, memorizing crap. No knowledge is ever connected to liberation. So, point one, no deed nor action are ever liberating. Neither is empirical knowledge or episteme. None of these three things are connected to the apophaticism and the theurgy, the synthesis of liberation. The only logical conclusion that one can make, and this is also what the Greeks and the Indians taught emphatically, at least the monistic Indians. There are all sort of crazy-ass philosophies in ancient Greek and India. There's endless debates between all sorts of heretics like the Jains and the nihilists and the atomists. I mean, the Greeks had their atomists and their Stoics and all these crazy-ass weirdos teaching illogical, crazy philosophies. So when I say ancient Greeks and ancient Indians, I'm actually talking the ones that actually taught logical, intelligent, true, and helpful and beneficial things, i.e. the Platonists, the Neoplatonists, Advaita Vedanta, the actual teachings in the five Nikayas, which predated all sectarian creations, which started out about the 2nd century CE, i.e. the Sarvastivadins, who became the Theravadins. By the way, all those yellow-robed monks you see in Sri Lanka, Thailand, and Burma, those are, by definition, sectarian radical nihilists. Theravadins are originally Sarvastivadins, which literally translates as, this is all there is ism. It is a type of atomistic nihilism, by the way. But that's a matter for another video. I'm an expert on that topic, by the way. Getting back to the disobjectification phenomenology and seeing self and what is not self, the premise of using the analogy of someone being sad in a movie or being happy, and like I said, we've got the phrase of getting caught up in the movie. Getting caught up in is the identification due to ignorance. Of course, we can't go too far with that analogy. We're talking about primordial ignorance when someone pays $5 and goes, movies more than $5 now, pays $5 to go see a movie and gets sad or happy. But the point is to understand that this identification or ignorance is projection. The fundamental premise of all monistic metaphysics is the projection or seeing self in what is not self. When you look in the mirror and you think that's yourself, that is not only an ignorant belief system, it is also completely antithetical to liberation, liberation ontology, synthesis, and theurgy. I hope you know what theurgy is. If you don't know what theurgy is, you should probably look that word up. Theurgy. You weren't taught this stuff in school or college. Like, well, what's theurgy? People say, what's apophatism? It's like, oh my God. Rich people back in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, they took their kids to learn this stuff, you know? The kids weren't superior because they were rich, you know, or good genes. It's because they got a real education from people that taught. Back, you know, between the 12th to the 16th century, you got a Platonic education. The rich folks gave their kids some real learning. They learned Aristotle, Plato, Neoplatonists, and man, they could think. The most important thing that anybody could do is not memorize shit or know shit, is learning how to think. And if you learn nothing else from that, even if you're a nihilist and an atomist and a materialist, at least you could learn how to think, and you'll be far better off than everybody else you know. Far better off. As far as having the toolbox inside your brain to figure out anything and everything that comes your way in life. Literally, anything and everything. Figure it out faster and better than anybody else, and be logical about it. Man, I don't need this iPad, by the way. I just had some key points on here, like I said, that I wanted to hit, but I could go a lot more into this topic, but I don't know how much further I go into it without slipping down a dark hole that everybody's like, oh, where are you? What's this guy talking about? Yeah, that's my problem. It's like, you know, how far do you go in talking about, you know, theurgy and this identification phenomenology and the premise by which one identifies and the attribution that is the prima causa thereof, that is the principle of reversal or elimination of monistic metaphysics. And it's like, well, how far do you discuss that topic without everybody rolling their eyes and looking at you like an alien? But that is the identification phenomenology that is the clavis or the key of all Indian, Greek, Egyptian monistic metaphysics. And you see self in what is not self when you project yourself as to or in something else, or seeing self in what is not self, i.e. the true self or the spiritus sanctum, in what is merely the psychophysical, which is namisoata, not the soul, then therein lies the issue. And that liberation ontology and theurgy is the premise of all monistic metaphysics, at least the good ones. Actually, there are no bad monistic metaphysics. There are some that are slightly misguided, but all forms of monism, Greek and Indian, are pretty hardcore. Some of it's really hardcore, like you start reading Syrianus or Damasius or Simplicius. Whew. And you gone deep down the rabbit hole then. I got too many cameras on this table. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Hope you liked this video. Hope I didn't get too abstruse. That's one of my favorite words, abstruse. Too abstruse for you. If you like this video, you can always click the link below. Or tell me to jump off a cliff, whatever makes you happy. Thank you so much. Goodbye.